Already doing well.
Oh my God.
So we're lucky to have Dr. Hobart Harris here. He is Chief of Division of General Surgery and Professor of Surgery here at UCSF. And I think embodies why a lot of what is good about UCSF. So people, intelligent, amazing, brilliant people with varied interests and varied pathways. And I think hearing his story will probably, tell you a lot more about Hobart than generally meets the eye. So thanks again for coming.
My pleasure.
And regaling us with all these stories.
Sure. So, the title of my talk is Serendipity and Randomness. And what I'm referring to is the fact that as I reflect over the past couple decades of my career, I realize that the things that I've been most successful at doing, and also some of my greatest failures, have been a result of either my ability to embrace serendipity and randomness or my unwillingness to do so. So that's the genesis of the title. Just so we're all thinking about the same thing. Serendipity is not the process by which, as a plumber, I'm fixing a leak and I bump my head and all of a sudden think up a cure for cancer. Serendipity is really a process whereby, maybe as a cancer biologist, I'm fixing the sink and I bump my head and all of a sudden think up a cure for cancer. It's really recognizing otherwise unrecognized opportunities, but usually within a realm of relative expertise, or at least focus and discipline on your behalf. And I think there's really good data, if you look for it, to support the idea that serendipity is alive and well, certainly in our lives, outside of our professions, and within the profession of medicine and scientific research. And there actually are numerous well-known observations or discoveries that were the result of serendipity. Though we all know, by reading and contributing to the scientific literature, we work quite hard to eliminate all traces of serendipity in the work that we do. Invariably, we have a hypothesis, we embark upon a series of experiments. They either don't work or they provide the answer to a question we actually weren't asking. But when we report it as if, oh yes, that was the question I was asking, and this is the experiment I planned, here's the data, and great, I proved my hypothesis. So if that's the way you're looking for your life and your work to evolve, I'm sad here to tell you that's not going to be the case. So instead, if you're poised and prepared to embrace those random events and actually seek and identify success in what initially can appear as a failure or a shortcoming, I think you're in good shape. So now, over the years, I've had the pleasure and honor of presenting to your predecessors, and my thought has always been that you were kind of interested in hearing about just people's individual paths and perhaps the challenges they encountered. And maybe that's not true, but I certainly want this presentation to be of value to you. I've actually designed it to be of maximum value to me, but I'm happy to go ahead and modify that. And what I mean by that is I'm going to talk to you about something that I'm passionate about. Every year, I was looking through presentations I've given in past years, and there's actually kind of a psychoanalytical evolution taking place. If you look at what it was that I, at that particular point in time, was really kind of excited about it.
You should make a sign one.
Exactly, yeah. So, I hope this presentation doesn't seem too far fetched, and if it does, just tell me, I'm not really interested in that. Tell me about X, Y, or Z. So, just a little bit about my background. Not that my background is particularly special, but just so you know kind of who I am and where I was born and raised in the Midwest. Went and did all my undergraduate medical school training on the East Coast, and then had always enjoyed the Golden Gate Bridge. Thought, well, why don't I train for a while in San Francisco before I go back home to Michigan? And came here almost 30 years ago and never left. So the first clue to you there is that by and large, somebody told me this when I was training, and I thought they were just wrong, that the single greatest predictor of where you're going to establish your career is where you do your kind of post-medical school training, your residency. So let's keep it in mind when you're picking your residencies. In any case, been here on the faculty and was presumably promoted to the chief of the division about 11 years ago. I'm still not so sure, but I'm pretty sure that wasn't a promotion now, but at the time it was. And came from SFGH, where I had started my academic career on faculty, to Parnassus, and was inundated shortly thereafter with this problem that I honestly don't remember treating or taking care of patients with this condition while a trainee. And that problem is the problem of incisional hernias. So, just so we know, an incisional hernia, and maybe sometimes it'll be referred to as a ventral hernia, is basically the fact that when we have performed open abdominal surgeries in a not insignificant number of cases, and I'll talk about the statistics in a minute, the incision doesn't completely heal, and the person is left with an area of weakness. There are an estimated 5 million open abdominal surgeries each year in the U.S., and anywhere from 10 to as high as 25% of the time, you're going to have this inadequate healing and the formation of an incisional hernia. Now, it may not strike you right off the bat, but that's really a pretty appalling failure rate. If 1 out of every 10 times, perhaps 1 out of every 4 times you do something, you're unsuccessful, and something as seemingly basic and routine as closing the incision I made in order to perform an operation, it's kind of embarrassing as a surgeon. However, that's the reality. Furthermore, I would wager, though I don't have hard evidence of proof of this, that the majority of patients who are undergoing a process for abdominal surgery, the consent process does not include the discussion of this potential complication. We'll talk about bleeding and urinary tract infections and obviously death, but it's very uncommon, in my experience, that patients are actually told about this particular problem beforehand. So they can be small, as you see there. There's just a little small transverse incision, and I hope you can see with this lighting, looks like it's got a little maybe tennis ball below the skin. They can get a little bigger. So here you have now a vertically oriented incision and a much larger bulge. And then this is kind of like the most stark example that I've ever seen, and probably merits the cover of my autobiography. Huge hernia, just huge. Now this, of course, is a once-in-a-lifetime scenario, but you probably can't tell from the picture, but the incision that results in this hernia goes along here. And these patients in general, but that particular patient in particular kind of got me thinking. There are over 400,000 of these repairs being performed each year. So it's this is probably maybe the 3rd or 4th most common operation that a general surgeon will perform. Just to give you comparable numbers, general surgeons repair about 800,000 groin hernias a year, and probably somewhere approaching 1 million appendectomies, or actually more like 1 million cholecystectomies. So, those are very great. This is like bread and butter surgery for general surgeons. Probably adds somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 billion to our healthcare economy. And the risk factors are things that are very, very common, and perhaps even becoming more common in society, such as obesity, smoking, and diabetes. Now, in thinking about this particular problem, the entire industry, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, everyone is really focused on what's the best way to repair this hernia. Very common problem, you need to do it several 100,000 times a year. So what's the best synthetic? A lot of times we put in a piece of mesh, which may be made out of a soft plastic material. It may be biologic tissue derived from the skin of a human or skin of a pig or cow. There are different approaches in terms of what sort of suture to use, what sort of surgical technique. But if you really think about it, the solution that we need to be focused on is preventing the hernia in the first place, right? I mean, you want to prevent this guy here at one point looked like that. But the repair to fix a hernia that size failed, and it failed again, and each time it failed, this is just unfortunate. The guy, if you're flipping a coin and you have 50% failure rate each time, he unfortunately is the guy who failed 10 times. Yeah.
Is the failure rate of closing these ventral hernias the same as like 10 to 25%?
It's higher. Yeah. The failure rate is probably at least 40%. And for a variety of reasons, including the fact that not only is this not a problem that, how many of you have ever even heard of this problem before right now? Oh, good. Good. Okay. That's good. Because it's not something that anyone tracks. So right now, for example, in medicine, people will tell you how frequently, as a general surgeon, I gave antibiotics within 60 minutes of an incision. That's a measure, an outcome measure, a quality process. No one's really monitoring this, and it turns out that these hernias tend to occur within a year to a year and a half of the operation that you had. But if you follow patients long enough, the rate just continues to climb. So in answer to your question, probably 40% fail, but that number is really depending on when you look. If you wait a little longer, that number is probably 45%. You wait longer, it'd be 50%, and so forth. So a solution. Literally, I remember the moment I was flying back on an airplane, and as a general surgeon and as a chief of division, I felt obligated to speak to any industry representative who showed up at the doorstep wanting to peddle their newest product. I don't know why I felt obligated to do that, but I did. And so I was being inundated by people selling all sorts of materials. Use this product, use that product, etc. And I ultimately felt like I needed to have a better independent understanding of the entire field and kind of the history of hernia repair, so that I could bring some kind of independent, I thought, expertise, or at least appreciation for the context in which all of these products are being developed. And I, surprisingly enough, learned in reading about the history of hernia repair and dating back to the 1800s that surgeons for about 50 years had been using fine silver wire mesh to fix hernias like this. So this obviously was not a problem that was new to the 20th century. But these so imagine that a surgeon would pound some nails into a board about the size of the hernia defect they were trying to repair. They'd take a fine silver wire and kind of run it back and forth and make a handmade mesh. And they'd place this mesh between the leaves of the abdominal oblique muscles, or perhaps even within the rectus sheath. And what they observed was that this would provoke a very exaggerated scar or inflammatory response, and that would kind of strengthen and basically form a repair. And these operations were performed up until the 1940s, but then fell out of fashion because of the advent of polymer chemistry. And soon, by late 40s, early 50s, you had a number of polymers, including polypropylene, which is the current kind of most commonly used synthetic material for fixing this problem. Anyway, it occurred to me at that time that while you may not want to use a silver wire, the body's response to implanted silver could perhaps be used, and instead of using it in response to an existing hernia, you might use it at the end of an operation to try and decrease the chance of actually creating it, or the patient developing a hernia following your elective surgery or your emergency surgery. So I spent about 2 years just reading about silver, not every day, not all the time, periodically. Because I felt like the idea was too simple, and somebody must have thought of it And because there are no original ideas, right? And I figured that if I read enough, I could figure out a reason why it either wasn't going to work, how someone else had already tried it, X, Y, and Z. Lo and behold, I couldn't. Now silver, so the solution that I'm going to present to you today is this combination of these silver microparticles and a tissue sealant, basically fiber and glue. The idea is that this combination would actually accelerate wound healing or cause this fibrotic response that I described to you before, that it would be something that would be relatively easy to use, it'd be safe, non-toxic to the patient. And once I had this idea, I thought, well, I first need to then test it if I can't find any obvious reason in the literature why it wouldn't work. So there is an existing animal model for incisional hernias. Take a rat, make an incision, as you see here, a laparotomy. You take two very, very fine catgut sutures. So these are sutures that rapidly absorb. They probably are present no longer than a week. And putting only two and having them present for less than a week, you predict that incision isn't going to heal well. And in fact, what you see in those rats within probably a week or two of their surgery is they have a hernia here. It may not look exactly like it does in the patient, but I think you'll buy that as a hernia. And we then tried our product. And so we took animals, and instead of closing the way I showed you there, we put this little saline on the closure. We put a little bit of tissue sealant alone, the fiber glue. Then we added 2 different doses, concentrations of the silver microparticles to that fiber glue mixture. And this is the data. Now, I've actually been doing experiments in one shape or another since I was in college. Right? We've all done a thesis or something. This was actually the very first time I had ever planned an experiment, making a variety of assumptions about what should be the concentration, et cetera, what should be the model. Gave the instructions to somebody else, because I'm actually not in the lab personally doing the experiment, so I hired somebody and said, okay, this is your project, do this. They collected the data, didn't necessarily even know, it wasn't even compiled and analyzed, it was just kind of like raw data. And this was the result. So this was very dramatic to me. Not only because you see such a difference in terms of the control group, 100% of those animals developing a hernia, and these animals down at 10%, but showing actual dose dependency, suggesting that there's a physiology here that we can manipulate by something as simple as changing the concentration of silver particles in naturally occurring protein matrix. So you may or may not be aware, but there is, I'd be interested if you felt this or not, but the faculty are being now encouraged to pursue innovation at UCSF. Have you felt that at all?
It's called creativity.
But this is different. Our chancellor, has a background from industry, so you can imagine that, coming in on the heels of a Nobel laureate cancer biologist, she probably wasn't going to try and tell us how to do research better. Right? That really wasn't her claim to fame. But what she was going to be able to tell us how to be more business-like and perhaps how to commercialize innovation and research. And why is that all relevant? Because it just means that there are now resources available to help people like yourselves who have novel ideas learn how to actually convert an idea into a commercially viable product, or at least to go through the process to determine whether that is a potential. Now, you may have no interest in it. To tell you the truth, before I had these ideas, I had no interest whatsoever in business or entrepreneurship. But this just shows you a picture of one of our control animals, and then one has been treated with the product that we just call MyoSeal. Looks a little better. So if you look at these wounds under a microscope, as you see here with histology, this would be equivalent to the rat rectus muscle. This is the location of the incision. It'd be another rectus muscle over here, so the midline incision would be running up and down in this direction. You can see that there is some collagen as labeled, and these little black particles are all the silver microparticles, and they're surrounded, though I can't convincingly show you, these are actually multinucleated giant cells. So you may recall from your pathology that when a phagocyte encounters a foreign particle too large to be ingested, they will frequently fuse with adjacent phagocytes and form these multinucleated, essentially, collagen factories. That the next response is then to actually wall off that foreign body, since it couldn't be ingested and otherwise eliminated. So that's what we think is probably the mechanism here, forming this fibrotic response. If you're thinking about using something as a prophylactic, so now the idea would be, end of every surgery, you take 30 to 60 seconds to spray this material on the closed muscle, you close however you would close it as a surgeon. But let's say, for example, it's the incidence rate of incisional hernia is 10%. That means you're going to be treating 9 people who weren't going to get a hernia, and only that 10th person would actually benefit. The problem is we don't have a way of predicting who that 1 out of 10 person is, so you got to treat them all. It's prophylactic. As a result, you have to also make sure that you're not going to be harming the other 9 people. So we did this experiment. So here, rather than having a incision closed with 2 fine catgut sutures that you know are going to dissolve and they're going to result in a hernia, here the wound is closed normally, closed in a way that's not going to cause a hernia. So you really want to see what would the product's effect be on an incision that would otherwise heal normally, get healed normally. In other words, is this going to cause some sort of hypertrophic scarring or exaggerated scar response, and perhaps be something that would be painful or in some way disfigured? And what this basically shows now, instead of looking at the rate of hernias, we're looking at just how strong is the wound. Is there going to be any sort of weakening or hypertrophic scar response? And as you can see, essentially in the absence of wound failure, treating the wounds with the sealant alone or any concentration of the microparticles really made them indistinguishable in terms of strength relative to the otherwise normally healing control. That makes sense? So I showed this data, so this is basically something that I'm not working in my garage, but basically, there's no grant here. I am essentially cobbling together discretionary funds that I just have access to, but this isn't any sort of formal program. I haven't disclosed my intellectual property to the university, something that you all would need to know about if you ever want to follow this path. The fact of the matter is that the university owns my ideas. They own all my ideas related to the reason why they've employed me. So this is actually theirs. That's a different discussion, so I'm happy to get into if you'd like to. But I showed this data to a plastic surgeon friend of mine who I've done research with in the past. And he immediately looked at it and thought that this was essentially just a wound healing process, a wound healing drug. That may sound obvious in retrospect, but I had not initially even asked the question, would there be any other circumstances or indications for this sort of a product? And he did, and he wanted to determine whether this